All right, well, good afternoon. I'm Phil Brink, Consulting Coordinator of Colorado Cattlemen's Ag Water Network. Welcome to our 10th webinar that's hosted by the Ag Water Network. We host these webinars in order to help keep ag producers and other water stakeholders informed about water-related issues that affect them. So including watershed and stream management planning, as well as water leasing, water rights, and water quality. Our presenter today is Weston Toll from the Colorado State Forest Service. He will be focusing on wildfire and watershed management planning and overviewing the conditions of our forests and how watershed management planning fits into getting back to healthier, more resilient forests. A little background on the Ag Water Network. We were created by Colorado Cattlemen's Association about 5 years ago out of concern over the increasing loss of irrigated ag land. So our mission is really very simple. It's about helping to keep ag water connected with ag land. And we do that through a number of means, through outreach in the form of meetings, workshops, presentations, and webinars like today's, as well as collaboration with other water-oriented organizations, and providing technical resources and tools, which are available on our website at agwaternetwork.org, agwaternetwork.org. If you have any questions, technical issues, connectivity, or other problems related to hearing the webinar or seeing it, you can contact Erin at Erin, E-R-I-N, at coloradocattle.org. That's Erin at coloradocattle.org. Or you can call our office at CCA at 303-431-6422. That's 303-431-6422 if you're having any technical issues. We are recording today's webinar, so it will be posted on our website later at agwaternetwork.org, along with the highlights of the webinar. Our speaker today is Weston Toll. He is a watershed program specialist with the Colorado State Forest Service. Weston has worked in wildland fire, fuels, and watershed management for 15 years in the federal government, state government, and nonprofit sectors. And in his current capacity, Weston works closely with a diverse set of partners to promote healthy watersheds by facilitating education, implementation, and monitoring of forest restoration projects. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Natural Resource Management from the University of Wyoming, and he lives in beautiful Fort Collins with his family. Welcome, Weston.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So before we jump into Weston's presentation, we're going to show you a clip from a video that we just recently completed on wildfire, forest management, and watershed management planning. And we're really pleased with how this came out, and we hope that it can be used as a resource around the state. It's really relevant to both agriculture and the other uses. So Erin, when you're ready, you can go ahead and start that.
Phil, I just want to confirm that you can see it up on the screen.
I can't see it. If you'd like, we can go on. If you feel like it might take a while, Erin, we could go ahead and start and show the video clip at the end, or if...
It should play. We should be good.
There we go.
Everybody wants clean water. It's important for people to drink. It's important for ag producers. It's important for wildlife, the beauty around here. That's why you all come here.
As time has changed and our uses have changed, recreation certainly is very, very dependent on water, whether you're in a reservoir, whether you're going down the river in a raft. The pressures from urbanization, from municipal use in cities. So we have to rethink how we use water. We can't just do it like we did 100 years ago.
And this headwater area, like a lot of similar areas in Colorado, this is a source water for 8 major rivers coming out of the state, most of which are on federal land and land managed by the Forest Service. So it's a big footprint from these forests.
It's a watershed, it's a catchment, and whatever happens in the catchment affects what actually ultimately gets in the stream and moves downstream. And so it's important that we manage these forests to maintain clean water that ultimately is stored on the land, released into base flows, and provides clean water for all.
Great, thanks, Aaron. And the full video is 5 minutes long, and you can access that through our website. It's up right now at agwaternetwork.org. So the video is kind of a great segue into your presentation, Weston, and we've also unfortunately got really a kind of a distressingly timely occurrence of wildfire that is kind of queued up in advance of your presentation to really add a exclamation point to how important this issue is. We've got the fires burning by Grand Junction, the Pine Gulch Fire, which I understand is now the 6th largest in the state. And we've got the Grizzly Creek Fire. In fact, we have CCA members right now today that are running hard trying to get cattle moved out of harm's way. So a really relevant topic now, and certainly going into the future, it's going to be even more so. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and let you start into your presentation, and we'll kind of see how much time we have at the end for questions. But if people do have questions, they can send those in by clicking on the chat at the bottom of their screen. So Weston, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Sounds good. Let me just get my presentation pulled up here. And just want to confirm that you can see it right now.
Yes,
Yep.
we can see it.
Okay, let's jump in then. Thanks, Phil, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Weston Toll, and I'm the Watershed Program Specialist with the Colorado State Forest Service. And I'd like to just take a moment to thank Phil and Aaron for inviting me to present on the webinar today. One of the goals of the State Forest Service is to engage with and educate the public on forest health issues. And as Phil mentioned, I think today's topic has a huge influence not only on what's happening around the state and around the West right now, but also a big influence on the agriculture industry as well. You know, healthy forests directly contribute to water quality and quantity, which of course is good business, good for your business and livelihoods in your sector specifically. So Phil mentioned a little bit about my background, but I wanted to go a little bit more into the State Forest Service and what we do. The Colorado State Forest Service is a service and outreach agency that's housed within the Warner College of Natural Resources at Colorado State University. We're a little bit unique in that all 50 states and U.S. territories all have a state forestry agency, but most of them are housed within the Department of Natural Resources within the state government. So us, along with 5 or 6 other states, elected to have the state forestry agency within the land grant institution. So we're a little bit unique, but it also gives us access to some cutting edge research that comes out of the Warner College of Natural Resources. We have 19 field offices throughout the state, which I'll show a map of that at the end here, and around 110 full-time employees, mostly foresters scattered throughout those field offices around the state. Again, my position is the Watershed Program Specialist, and in this capacity, I represent CSFS on various statewide watershed collaboratives. I try to engage with partners as much as possible, specifically major front range water providers and strategic planning, funding, and implementation. And this includes some of the forest restoration and wildland fire mitigation activities that we're going to go over today. And it's my ultimate goal to help break down the silos between agencies and organizations to help build stronger communication networks, which is another thing that I hope that we're accomplishing today. So with that, we'll jump into the presentation here. There's always some questions about and confusion about exactly what a watershed is. So I like to start all my presentations off with that to kind of set the tone. And also why people should care about what's happening up or downstream of them. And then hopefully we'll address some of the questions you may have, and we'll leave some time at the end, hopefully, for people to ask specific questions if they have them. But the book answer is: a watershed is characterized as an area or ridge of land that separates waters flowing into different rivers, basins, or seas. So you can see on the graphic here that a drop of water falling on one side of the hill versus another can have a much different journey from creek to river to bigger river, ultimately to the ocean. As many of you know, and what was mentioned in the short clip of the video there, that Colorado is a headwater state. And you also probably know that sustainable water supplies are one of the most critical natural resources in the American West. Much of the region relies on Colorado for water, with 19 states and Mexico receiving at least some of their supply from the state's forested watersheds. Water sourced in Colorado has value for a broad range of uses that support economies and security, including agricultural production, of course, municipal consumption, recreational activities, as well as wildlife habitat. Colorado's semi-arid climate, reoccurring droughts, and competing demands for an increasingly limited resource makes sound management of these water supplies critical. So you can see there on the map where some of these major river basins start in Colorado and then flow downstream, both to the Pacific as well as the Gulf of Mexico. The state's agriculture industry contributes to around $40 billion annually to the economy of the state and remains the primary consumer of the state's water. Irrigated agriculture accounts for approximately 86% of total water diversions, and all this is according to Colorado's water plan. And that states that farmers and ranchers work to supply food to a rapidly growing population, specifically in our state. Because of this, they're increasingly competing with non-agricultural users who have their own essential needs for the state's water supply. So that being said, Colorado's forested watersheds provide the supply of clean water and biological diversity needed for a future that is balanced both socially and ecologically. There's an important connection between water quality and the health of the forested watershed from which it flows. In recent years, Colorado and other Western states have experienced forests becoming unhealthy, setting the stage for large wildfires and widespread insect and disease outbreaks. Currently, projections of increased disturbance frequency and severity have created concerns regarding the sustained delivery of clean water from headwater forests. Again, referring back to Colorado's water plan, approximately 80% of Colorado's population relies on forested watersheds to deliver municipal water supplies. A couple of facts for you all: a 50 to 200% increase in annual area burned is projected in Colorado. And those come from models with a lot of data that goes into them, including predicted cover change, predicted climate change, increased people moving into the state. All that stuff goes into those models. And that's why there's such a big between 50 to 200% increase kind of range there. Over 6 million acres have been affected by insect outbreaks in Colorado since the mid-1990s. So that's another major source of disturbance in Colorado forests. And we'll go over that here in just a minute. And then again, just making that point that Colorado residents will have an increasing demand for water. There's going to be quite a lot of more people, unfortunately, moving into our beautiful state by the year 2050. Although forest disturbances, including these wildfire and insect and disease issues, are a natural part of our environment, and we'll go over that in a little bit too, Colorado's experienced increasing numbers of large and high severity wildfires, and also unparalleled levels of bark beetle-caused tree mortality. These disturbances are creating concerns over the sustained delivery of this clean water from our forested watersheds. Effects of these uncharacteristic wildfires to watershed health include sedimentation of water supply infrastructure, and that includes agriculture, diversion canals, and that kind of thing. Undesirable changes in forest conditions and decreased water quality. So I've up on the screen right now some of those threats, which include conversion of forest cover, which includes the change in species type due to climate change and other disturbances, and deforestation due to fire and insects. Again, we've already mentioned it, but for increase in forest insects and disease, as well as increase in wildfire severity, frequency, and duration. A lack of seedling regeneration post-disturbance. So once these disturbances come through, the trees are having a hard time recovering. Seasonal changes in precipitation. So we're seeing more frequent heavy precipitation events, and as well as prolonged drought. Reduced soil moisture. Again, the increased population, placing additional strain on the limited water supply, and then maintaining a balance between public access, including the need for road construction, which can also lead to adverse effects for water quality. Really quick, just want to mention some of the insects and disease that we are facing. So you can see the list there: Douglas fir beetle, the Douglas fir tussock moth, dwarf mistletoe, the Ips beetle, the spruce beetle, and of course the notorious mountain pine beetle. So the mountain pine beetle epidemic has slowed in Colorado. As you can see on this graph here with the lighter blue, it kind of peaked around 2008 or 2009 and has kind of run its course. But the next thing that's coming up is the spruce beetle. It's really increased in recent years, and these beetles affect our high elevation forests. So the question there really is how is this going to have an effect on our winter snowpack in the future. This map here shows the area around Rocky Mountain National Park, and the bright purple highlights some of the areas being affected by spruce beetle way up there in our high elevation forests. So I think I mentioned earlier, but fire does play a critical role in maintaining the health of our fire-dependent forest, shrublands, and grassland ecosystems in Colorado. Some lower elevation forests rely on frequent low-intensity fires to control regeneration and reduce understory vegetation, while some higher elevation forest types, such as lodgepole pine, rely on a more high-intensity fire to regenerate the forest. A long history of fire suppression, though, has, as well as a lack of forest management, has altered the historical fire cycles and led to a dangerous buildup of fuel in some areas. And this is leading to that higher incidence of uncharacteristic wildfire. On top of that, fire creates carbon emissions through direct burning, followed by the decay of trees and other vegetation destroyed by the fire. So uncharacteristic wildfires can also damage soils and impair future forest recovery, which also leads to the potential loss of future carbon sequestration from these areas, these impacted acres. Mentioned earlier too, but population growth and what's called the wildland urban interface, or sometimes you'll hear it called WUI, which is the area where structures and other human developments meet or intermingle with wildland vegetation. So this presents an additional challenge for public safety and community resiliency. As more people choose to live in wildfire-prone areas, additional homes and lives are at increased risk of being affected by these wildfires. You can see on the screen right now, there's some adaptations that we'll go and show pictures of here in a minute, but ponderosa pine specifically has adapted to frequent fire with things like thick bark, serotinous cones, which are a part of the lodgepole pine forest. So these are cones that fall to the ground and are covered with sap from the tree. They don't actually open until exposed to direct flame or sunlight. So they respond very favorably to fire. And again, when fire does not occur according to these cycles, the forest resilience can decrease, and some of these events can have a really adverse effect. Of the 20 largest fires in Colorado history, 5 occurred in 2018 alone and burned a combined 267,000 acres. So on the map here, the red blobs are these major fires we've had recently, and you can see they're really scattered throughout the state and really affect the majority of our citizens here within Colorado. The wildfire season is lengthened due to a changing climate, resulting in wildfires that start earlier, last longer, cost more to suppress, cause more damage, and threaten more lives than ever before. Climate impacts and vulnerabilities are influencing vegetation and fire occurrence through warmer temperatures, both annually as well as seasonally. More days with extreme heat. I don't know about you guys, but I'm here in Fort Collins today, and it's supposed to be almost 100 degrees today. So we're definitely feeling that this summer, which will affect some of the fires we have this year for sure, as well as more variable precipitation. As of 2017, again, going back to the wildland urban interface, more than 2.9 million people, which is half of the state's population, live within the wildland urban interface. Currently, the interface covers approximately 3.2 million acres in Colorado, but there's some models that are showing that that could encompass over 9 million acres by 2040. During that time, it's projected that our state's population will increase from 7.7 million to 9.3 million. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, as the population increases, human exposure to the negative impacts of wildfire are only going to increase as well. It's really going to create a huge public health issue due to decreased water quality as well as air pollution due to smoke. The good news is a lot of communities throughout the state have been proactively addressing wildfire hazards through the development of what are called community wildfire protection plans. These plans bring together diverse local interests to discuss mutual concerns for public safety, community sustainability, as well as natural resources. So up on the screen here, you see some adverse effects from post-fire, including the Buffalo Creek fire, which burned west of Denver back in 1996. And you can see after this fire burned, we had a large precipitation event, which washed a lot of the ash and debris down into the creek system and then into some of Denver Water's collection reservoirs, which we'll show here in just a second. And then the other photo is the Spring Creek fire, which was just a couple years ago, 2018, down in the La Vida area. This is a picture of Strontia Springs Reservoir, which is one of the most important reservoirs in the Denver water collection system. So after those post-fire flooding, a lot of the ash and debris and soil washed down into the reservoir system, reducing capacity by up to 1/3. About 10 years ago, they were still dealing with it. They spent over $30 million trying to dredge out the reservoir and are still, honestly, 20 years later, more than 20 years later, dealing with this issue. So far, they've removed around 625,000 cubic yards of sediment, which is enough to fill Mile High Stadium 200 feet deep. So that fire, which by 1996 standards was massive, it was around 15,000 acres, but by today's standards, unfortunately, that's considered a small fire, but just goes to show almost 25 years later, we're still dealing with some of those post-fire impacts to some really important infrastructure. This is a picture of Chapman Reservoir, another really important reservoir for Denver water. And the fire you see around that was the Hayman fire, which is still the largest fire by acreage in state history. And you can see, as far as the eye can see, it really burned on severely across the landscape. So these catastrophic fires really affect the nutrient cycling and physical, chemical, and biological properties of soils. The estimates from the Hyde Park fire, which burned west of Fort Collins in 2012, another large fire, it was almost 90,000 acres. But estimates from that fire predicted the post-fire soil erosion rates as high as 9 tons per acre in high burn severity areas. And it's taken, that was what, 8 years ago. It's still, again, the vegetative recovery is still happening there to provide adequate plant-induced conditions to stabilize the hillsides. So on this photo here, I don't know if people are familiar with the Poudre River area, but this is where Stove Prairie Road intersects Highway 14 and Poudre River Canyon. And you can see Skin Gulch draining into the main stem of the Cache la Poudre River. All that ash and debris flowed into the main stem, which is a very important water supply for the cities of Fort Collins and Greeley, as well as a lot of ag producers in this area. So because of that, the river was taken offline for several months until it was cleaned up, essentially. So I do want to make the point that there's two faces of wildfire. So there's the one that we just went over, the dramatic agent of change, the destroyer of homes, and the one, all these adverse post-fire effects that we've been seeing. But fire is also a creator of ecosystems. It's a maintainer of watersheds and biodiversity. It's a physical driver of forest structure. It drives nutrient cycles, and it limits the insect and disease outbreaks that we've been seeing. So how do we get here? Much of Colorado evolved with fire. We're going to do kind of a case study of montane forests that we see throughout much of the state here on the Front Range, as well as down in the southwest part of the state. These are stands that are dominated by ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, so ponderosa mixed conifer forests. These forests were maintained with frequent low to moderate severity fire. And really over the last century, we've gotten really good at suppressing fires. So we've removed that from the ecosystem, which has created a thick and unhealthy situation in many of our forested watersheds. Western wildfires are also changing. They're becoming bigger and more intense. So you can see on the graph there where the number of fires is steadily increasing from the 60s into the 2000s. But that's really alarming is the number of acres burned per year has just really skyrocketed since about the mid-90s. And again, these large-scale wildfires have long-term consequences for our communities. Staying with that ponderosa pine theme, Western wildfires are changing because our forests have changed. This is, again, due to a legacy of management decisions and climate drivers, and is exacerbated by an increase of people living in forested areas. This is really perpetuating a vicious cycle of fire suppression leading to high-intensity fires. So taking a little bit of a look at how ponderosa pine interacts with fire. This type of tree has a fire return interval, so how often a fire occurs in a given point on the landscape, of 5 to 25 years with mixed severity. So that's low to moderate severity on some areas, as well as some at high intensity, taking out the sick trees, the dying trees, that kind of thing. Generally, the fire would stay on the ground. These forests were dominated by older trees with a protective thick outer bark. An open crown structure, they're self-pruning, and they need that frequent fire to kill seedlings of more shade-tolerant species, including Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, which are now acting as what we call ladder fuels. So the fire will get started in the understory of these shade-tolerant species, and it's able to get up into the overstory of the older trees and take out an entire stand that way. So this created a more diverse mosaic of habitats and forest structure across the landscape. You can see in the graphic there, due to some research in this area, the historic density of many of these stands was about 20 to 55 trees per acre. But in many areas, we're seeing 300 to 900 per acre. So how does that look? The forest on the left is thick and unhealthy. It's susceptible to disease, insects, and catastrophic wildfire, and that's what we're seeing in many areas. Whereas the one on the right is open, it's resilient, it's ready to receive that low severity fire. It's much better habitat for animals, and it prevents the spread of insects and disease. You could even say those trees are social distancing, staying with the theme that seems like it's part of all of our lives right now. So that's what we want to see: open canopy, diverse structure, thick bark, self-pruning, and ready to receive low to moderate severity fire. So how do we get back to some of these historical conditions? The goals of many of our forest restoration and hazardous fuels reduction work is to restore the fire regime to that low to mixed severity in these stands. We're looking to improve the forest health and structural diversity, to protect water quality, and then build skills, capacity, and understanding throughout all of our different partners. Now, there's a lot of barriers to getting, that sounds really good, but with everything, we need funding, we need willing landowners, we need operable terrain. So a lot of this work needs to be done on super steep, inaccessible slopes. And then there's that perception of fire, that all fire is bad. Smokey Bear's done a really good job of getting people interested in wildfire and preventing it, but we need to kind of change that perception so that people know that it's a natural part of the landscape. And then on top of that, we'll talk about it here in a little bit, but we don't have too much of a robust timber economy in Colorado. So the issue of what to do with the material once it's cut is one that we're running into on many project areas. So the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy is a framework that land management agencies and stakeholders use for addressing wildfire issues within the state. So this strategy is a collaborative process that seeks all land solutions to wildland fire management, focusing on 3 main goals, which include restoring and maintaining resilient landscapes, creating fire-adapted communities, and then safe and effective fire response. So within the state of Colorado, the first 2 goals are the primary responsibility of the State Forest Service, who I work with, while goal 3 of safe and effective fire response is the primary responsibility of the Division of Fire Prevention and Control. So now we can kind of dive into each leg of the stool of that is the cohesive strategy. The first one being resilient landscapes. And I don't want to go too in depth on some of these numbers here, but the biggest thing to take away is that photo there, an aerial photo of what we're really wanting these stands to look like. So you can see a big natural opening, lots of room, spacing between the crowns. And again, that's ready to receive low to moderate severity fire. Now, I like to tell people the scientific term for this is groupy clumpy, which I know isn't super scientific, but if you can imagine on the landscape, we want groups and clumps of trees with plenty of openings throughout. We really want to maximize the variability and diversity within the landscape. We're also trying to limit the amount of fuel on the ground. We want an increased ratio of ponderosa to other conifers, again, within this case study of ponderosa pine forests on the Front Range and southwest area of the state. And then minimize the area of high potential for active crown fire within project areas. The second leg of the stool, again, is for fire adapted communities. We're trying to get an increase in community awareness, support, increase in strategic defensible space around homes, and then the reduction in continuous tree cover in and around surrounding communities. The final leg of the stool is safe and effective fire response. So we're working together with multiple agencies to develop fire response strategies throughout the state. Looking for reduction of fuels to aid in fire suppression tactics so that firefighters can get into areas that need it in a safe and effective way. Improvement and development of local firefighter qualifications, improved coordination and communication between fire districts, as well as tactical and strategic planning. Really quick, I also wanted to touch on post-fire recovery. So the map on the left of this slide shows an aerial photograph of Chapman Reservoir, which again is located west of Denver. You can see from the lack of forest cover how severely the fire burned across this landscape. I mean, it looks like the Sahara Desert out there, and many areas within this area, it still looks that same way. If you're flying west out to California from Denver, next time you're on the left side of the plane, just look out your window and you can see the impact that this fire had on the forest just west of town there. The green polygons on here are post-fire replanting units. Some of this work continues to this day. This fire was almost 5 miles across in this area, and because of soil conditions and the arid nature of this area, trees are having a hard time regenerating, so we're trying to help them out a little bit with some of these post-fire plantings even to this day. Here's some additional photos showing post-fire recovery. The photo on the left shows native grasses and shrubs, which were helped along by some planting and seeding that helped stabilize the hillsides and soil to reduce runoff. And then on the right, you can see some of the post-fire planting of ponderosa pines. Here you can see some pictures of active forest management occurring. Again, with these fuels treatments, we're trying to recreate historical conditions by reducing the amount of fuel loading on the landscape. The black and white photo on the right of this slide demonstrates how things looked pre-fire suppression. I think this was from the early 1900s. So you can notice the space between trees. Today, I think we often think of a healthy forest as being incredibly verdant and thick, but that really wasn't the case in many of Colorado's forests before we started taking fire off the landscape. So here's an example of what a fuels reduction project looks like through implementation. This first photo shows the project getting started as a ridgetop fuel break. Here you can see the treatment progressing down slope. And then finally, a representation looking closer to that black and white photo that we just saw in the last slide. So that's really what we're trying to do with a lot of these treatment areas. And this is another one that's located kind of in that Strontia Springs, Chapman Reservoir area west of Denver. Here's some photos from that specific project, again showing that active forest management. And here I just wanted to make a note on some of the costs and avoided cost reduction through doing some of these projects. So I have some numbers here. We're given some real world examples. So the per acre cost, that includes suppression and homes lost, that kind of thing. For the West Fork Complex fire, which was a massive fire that burned in 2013 outside of South Fork and Creed, kind of in the middle part of the state, it was only around $600 per acre. And that's due to it primarily burning in the backcountry and not really threatening too much of the wildland urban interface. Whereas the per acre cost for the Hayman fire is estimated to be around $2,262 per acre. And then you compare that with the Black Forest fire, which burned in 2013 on the Palmer Divide, so just north of Colorado Springs and south of Castle Rock. And that was around $36,000, almost $37,000 per acre. And that's really due to the amount of property that was destroyed during that fire. So when we're looking at the treatments that we've shown in these last few slides, we're looking at these averaging about $1,500 to $2,500 per acre. So again, those costs of the Black Forest fire far exceeded what would have been the cost to treat that before the fire. On the other end of the spectrum, the per acre cost of the West Fork complex is likely less than any preventative measure would have cost. But the trade-off there is the West Fork fire again burned severely across much of the landscape in that area. So here's another on-the-ground photo showing some of the conditions that we want to see specifically here in these Front Range forests. These projects are definitely not easy to implement, and they face a variety of challenges, including lack of markets and product utilization. So we're having less and less mills in the state of Colorado, and the cost of getting this material out and to the mill just doesn't make sense, really. The products aren't worth as much as it costs to haul them to the mill. So one of the problems we run into is what to actually do with the trees that are cut off of some of these projects. There's a lack of large-scale contractors. Again, it's due to being a hard time to make money doing it. High cost per acre. As I mentioned before, it's $1,500 to $2,500 per acre in a lot of these areas. Much of the areas that need treatment are in steep and inaccessible areas, or even in wilderness areas where no treatments can occur. Future maintenance workload. So we're getting a lot of acres treated, but we need to think about 20 years down the road, revisiting these so that we don't get back into the same situation that we're in right now. Prescribed fire has not been used as a management tool. So again, prescribed fire is another tool in the toolbox. I don't have a whole lot on it today, but it's a very important tool that we can use throughout the state. It's much cheaper to implement prescribed fire. And so prescribed fire is when you purposefully set fire to a treatment unit under certain circumstances that have to be met through a burn plan. You have to have a certain amount of firefighters on scene, meet a certain amount of weather parameters, that kind of thing. But along with that is a lot of risk. And so it's not being currently used as a management tool in many parts of the state. Community understanding and acceptance. Many people are out enjoying Colorado and see people cutting down trees, and they're not too keen on that. So just trying to educate people that what we're trying to do is get it back to a more historic and healthy condition. And there's many more. But along with these challenges, we are seeing many successes that have come along with increased collaborative participation from appropriate parties. That includes an increase in large-scale cross-boundary projects. So we're seeing more treatments occur from federal land onto state land, onto private land, and that really needs to happen because these watersheds are in large areas across the landscape. And as we all know, fire and insects and all these disturbances don't recognize human boundaries. And so in these treatments, we need to try to do our best not to just treat the federal side of the fence or the state side of the fence and take these treatments across onto private land and that kind of thing. The markets and utilization is a hot topic. So there's been a lot of talk about what kind of economic incentive we can do to get the Colorado timber industry back up on its feet. An increase in education, understanding of risks to watersheds and communities, which again, I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk to you guys today. Hopefully getting the word out that this is really important stuff for everybody in the state. Acres are being treated, even given the current situation with coronavirus. Our foresters are still out there able to mark units and get stuff treated on the ground, as well as many more successes. So what's the path forward for watershed forest management? Well, we're trying to design treatments using historical reference and scientific documents such as General Technical Report 373, which the U.S. Forest Service put out, and again, prescribes that groupy, clumpy treatment type for these front range forests. Again, those landscape scale treatments, as I mentioned, developing key partnerships, figuring out what to do with all the material. We do need to figure out more reliable sources of funding for watershed restoration. We'll go over some of our state grant programs here in a minute, but a lot of them are tied to Tier 2 severance taxes, so oil and gas severance taxes, and it's just not really a reliable source for funding, so we need to figure that one out. Continue to educate the public again, begin planning for future expected climate change, and then I wanted to mention the 2020 Colorado Forest Action Plan. So this forest action plan is going to provide a strategic framework to address the benefits, conditions, and trends in Colorado's forests and the threats and challenges of the state's forests face really across political, jurisdictional, and ecological boundaries. So a little bit about state forest action plans. Every state has to do one. It's mandated by the Cooperative Forestry Assistance Act of 1978 and has been amended by the 2008 and 2014 Farm Bills. So going back to last year into this year, Colorado State Forest Service team that I'm actually had the honor of serving on has developed the 2020 Colorado Forest Action Plan, soliciting feedback from partners and stakeholders throughout the state. And while there are unique natural resource priorities for different regions of the state, the top priority identified of the statewide is reducing the risk of this uncharacteristic wildfire, which we've been talking about today. So the Forest Action Plan is going to be out for public consumption this fall sometime. And so I can stay in touch with Aaron and Phil, and maybe we can get that information out to people that are interested in seeing what that plan is going to look like and what areas of the state we're going to be prioritizing over the next 10 years or so. This is also going to be tied into our Forest Atlas, which is going to be both a internal and external application where you can get basically on the internet and look at the fire risk to your land, and then from there kind of come up with a plan of how to combat that in the future. So I can provide that link to Aaron and Phil to distribute if people are interested in looking at that application. Just really quick, wanted to run over some funding resources. So a couple of state-run programs that we administer are the Forest Restoration and Wildfire Risk Mitigation Grant Program. This was established back in 2017 to provide state support in the form of a competitive grant fund to encourage community-level actions across the state to reduce the risk of wildfire, promote forest health and forest restoration projects, and encourage the utilization of woody material for forest products and biomass energy. The second one is the Colorado Forest Legacy Program. It provides an opportunity for private landowners to retain ownership and management of their land while receiving compensation for unrealized development rights. So essentially, we would hold a conservation easement on the property, is how that would work. We also administer a variety of different federal grant programs. Probably don't have time to go into all those today, but I do encourage folks to reach out to their local field office. So again, we have 18 or 19 field offices located throughout the state. And if you follow that link on the right hand of this slide, you can find out where your field office is located. Here's a quick picture, snapshot of where these are located, kind of in the 4 quadrants of the state. So if you're looking at wanting to get some sort of grant to do active forest management, maybe on your own land, I encourage you to reach out to our local field offices. They'll be able to get you more information and kind of get more into the weeds than I have time to today. With that, I think that's all I have, Phil and Aaron. So I think we've got a little bit of time maybe to open up to any questions that folks might have.
Great. Thanks, Weston. That's a fantastic overview. I've got a lot of questions that we certainly are not going to have time to go through all of them, but I wanted to get to the ones that were submitted by participants here. One is, how do you address forest health issues in wilderness areas?
Yep.
Going back to just the challenges there.
Yep, very good question. So of course, wilderness areas are administered by the U.S. Forest Service, so it's public land, as well as National Park Services so national parks, Rocky Mountain National Park, Mesa Verde, some of those we have throughout the state are considered wilderness areas. And so with those, you can't really do anything as far as motorized or mechanical treatment goes. So no chainsaws, no feller bunchers, anything like that in those areas. The U.S. Forest Service does have some backcountry crews that can go in and do some work with crosscut saws and that kind of stuff, kind of old school, taking out areas that really need it. But the biggest thing with wilderness areas these days is the U.S. Forest Service is trying to get more towards a active management policy where they allow fires to burn in certain areas, including wilderness areas. And that's kind of twofold. One, it's really expensive and budgets are getting smaller and smaller. So if they're able to save money and let fires burn where it needs to burn, they're they're kind of letting it do that. And then the next thing that's really hot topic these days is just reducing the risk to people's lives by putting in there. So try not to put firefighters in harm's way where it's not really necessary. And again, I mean, wilderness areas are the steepest, highest areas that are oftentimes really important for water quality. So these are our acres that need to be treated, but really the best way forward and the cheapest way is just to let fire do its thing where necessary, and then look at possibly suppressing the fire as it comes out of the wilderness area closer to roads and the urban interface.
Okay. And that kind of gets back into a question I had on prioritization. I know that's a growing topic of interest in terms of getting the most bang for your buck and prioritizing. You mentioned that you were coming out with the Forest Atlas.
Yep.
It sounds like that is a tool that can be used to help people prioritize, it sounds like, the most vulnerable areas. Is that right?
Yep, that's exactly right. So there's been all kinds of prioritizations done throughout the state, more on a local level. So there's a lot of watershed coalitions and different partnerships that have prioritizations within certain watersheds. You know, for example, the Poudre watershed has its own prioritization. Ours is going to be a more statewide look. And again, yeah, I mean, we're looking at millions of acres that need treatment, and there's no way that'll cost billions of dollars to do, and we just don't have the capacity to do it. So we're taking data sets that incorporate massive amounts of data and show where on the landscape we can have the best effect. And that's part of what's going to come out through the Forest Action Plan, and will be shown on the Forest Atlas about here's the most important sub-watersheds throughout the state that really need the work the most. It's kind of
and on that note, Weston, I think we would definitely appreciate you keeping us apprised on that when those resources, the action plan and the atlas are available. Let us know and we'll push that out to everybody.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds
it
great.
Sounds like it's both of those are going to be a really important resources to utilize for local planning. You mentioned the local wildfire protection plans. It sounds like it'll be useful for those as well as overall watershed management planning.
Yep, and it'll be, you know, integrated into our grant programs too. So we're wanting to fund projects, obviously, in these high priority areas, so that we're not taking a shotgun approach and just doing small projects throughout the state. We want to really have that impact on these key acres, essentially.
I did want to ask you on the grant programs, what entities are eligible for the forest restoration and wildfire risk mitigation grants?
So, I mean, that can be pretty much anywhere from nonprofits to private landowners. Local government, I think we've given some out to, you know, counties, cities, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, it's not a huge amount. It's usually about $2 million a year, which needs to be matched 50-50 through either cash match or in kind, so volunteer rates and that kind of thing. It's going to be even less this year because that grant program, again, is tied to severance taxes. And as we all know, this year's a little bit unique in the fact that we're not making as much off those severance taxes as typical. So, you know, these are unfortunately more for smaller acreages through that specific grant program. So it's a lot of private landowners that apply for that one.
Mm-hmm. So it's highly competitive. And I imagine going back to the prioritization thing, you are probably going to be looking hard at trying to allocate those funds to the areas where you're going to get them the most improvement or the most protection by implementing mitigative strategies.
Yep, exactly. And you can find online an example of what the application process is for that grant program. And again, if people are interested in that, I would really encourage you to reach out to your local field office because there are some technical aspects to that grant program and they'd be a huge resource for you if you're interested.
I want to get to another question. This person says their local collaborative wants a heterogeneous forest county, including Gamble's Oak. Would it be better in terms of wildfire risk and water yield to discourage brush like Gamble's Oak?
Yeah, I mean, Gamble Oak is a unique one. It is a native species, but it's very volatile, and it's shown with the fire burning in Glenwood Canyon right now. You know, that's a lot of oak brush in that area, and so when it's ready, it definitely goes up. But it's again kind of adapted to do that, and so Gamble Oak responds to fire very well and will grow back the next year. You don't really typically see as much erosion coming off of a fire in Gamble Oak. So if it's removed by fire or by mechanical means, you probably would see an increase in water yield coming out of those areas. It's very difficult to treat though too. So again, if you cut it, it typically comes back thicker than it did before. So when we do treatments in Gamble Oak, typically it needs to be either masticated or cut and then immediately sprayed so that it doesn't come back gangbusters.
Gamble Oak sounds a lot like cheatgrass.
Yeah, exactly. It's very similar.
So another question, when and why did fire mitigation cease?
So it goes back to the turn of the century. It was 1910, I believe. They called it the Big Burn. There was a huge fire in Idaho and Montana that burned millions of acres, killed a lot of people. And essentially that happened right around when the U.S. Forest Service was being formed. And it basically became their policy. They had what was called a 10 a.m. policy. And so the policy all the way through, I think it was the 1970s or 80s, was this 10 a.m. policy where they wanted all fires put out by 10 a.m. the next day. And so basically we got really good at putting out fires, going back all the way to the turn of the century through essentially when Yellowstone burned in the late 80s. We just had the policy of putting everything out, keeping it small, throwing everything we had at it. And so that's kind of when it stopped, and that's when we removed fire from the landscape. And so right now we're kind of dealing with 100 years of poor management. You know, it's hard to say though, like even today, you know, we need to put fires out. We can't let them burn across the landscape because now we have people's livelihoods that are tied to the forest. We have people who live in the area. And so we just need to be very thoughtful about where we're putting fires out and where we're allowing them to burn. The other thing is typically historically fires were started by lightning, as well as Native Americans. They did burn a little bit of ground because they saw the benefits for wildlife and that kind of thing. But now we've kind of seen that flip-flopped where majority of fires are started by humans, you know, people throwing their cigarette out the window or leaving an unattended campfire. And so we still want to put fires out that are started by humans and you know, let ones that are start by lightning burn in certain areas.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very complex situation, and it's, you know, it's ecologically as well as socially.
Sure. Getting back to the prioritization question, is there a map of priority areas for forest mitigation right now? Is it related to watersheds? So does that tie back to the Atlas, or do you have currently resources available?
Yeah, to the Forest Action Plan. We're going to have what's called a composite map, and it'll show on basically, I believe it's 6th level watersheds. So the first level will be the Mississippi River or the Colorado River, some of these bigger ones. So you're going up into smaller chunks that are anywhere from 15 to 20,000 acres on the landscape, subdividing the state up into those polygons. And then you'll see on a scale of 1 to 10 how much prioritization we're putting towards these different watersheds. And there's a lot of data that goes into this composite map, but there's 3 primary ones that we're looking at, and it's wildfire risk, it's watersheds. So location of water supply infrastructure is a big one on the map. And then the third one is forest conditions. And so that's where you're looking at aerial, you know, data from aerial photos showing which areas need treatment the most. And that goes into like forest type and all that kind of thing. So that'll be the main statewide one. Like I mentioned, there's localized ones, and I would just have to know specifically where people live throughout the state, but that'll probably be the best place for folks to look once the Forest Action Plan and Forest Atlas are made available.
Mm-hmm. So I think you had touched on some of the challenges related to controlled burns. The question, what are the obstacles to starting controlled burns? And I think you mentioned, you know, we've got regulatory, we've got perceptional, we've got liability issues. All of those create major challenges for doing good, right? So how do you get around that? I guess are there entities that are kind of figuring out how to go ahead and do more controlled burns without the incredible cost and liability?
There are, and you know, in other parts of the country, it's the main tool they use. The Southeast United States, it's almost exclusively prescribed fire implementation. The thing they have there is roads everywhere and a much flatter landscape. in which to, and in many ways, a more predictable weather patterns. And so, like I mentioned before, there's a few main obstacles to implementing more prescribed fire here. There's weather, as I mentioned, it's very unpredictable, and typically we only have 2 small windows in the spring and fall in which to implement prescribed fire. There's the capacity issue. So depending on the complexity of the fire, whether it's on grass versus in a timber stand, you have to have a certain amount of people there. And oftentimes that's really hard to find in the spring and fall because much of our wildland fire workforce is seasonal in nature. So you need people. There's the perception, there's smoke. So smoke is a public health. It's considered an avoidable nuisance in the state of Colorado, unfortunately. And so there's a pretty rigorous permitting process that you have to go through, which I think people are working on hopefully getting changed. Because it's kind of like, how do you want your smoke? Do you want it for a couple of days under controlled circumstances, or do you want it, you know, High Park, Hayman style, where you're getting 2 months of more smoke than anybody should ever have to put up with? So this is, like I mentioned, it's a really important tool in our toolbox, but it just has to be the right conditions, the right area, having enough people there, waiting for the right weather. And there is that inherent risk out there, but I would argue that the risk is there no matter what. And again, do we want to maybe strike the match when it's October and not 100 degrees out, or do we want fires burning at this time of year where, again, it's, you know, 100 degrees out in Grand Junction and the fire's just running out of control?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Sorry, Phil, to interrupt. We have another webinar starting at 1 p.m. So
all right.
we're overbooked. But I see there's a lot of questions, and so we can follow up with those people that have asked those questions and follow up with you individually. Phil, if you want to wrap it up, and Weston.
Yeah. Well, needless to say, this is a topic of great interest, and we really appreciate your time today. And again, we did record this webinar, and we will post it at agwaternetwork.org along with the highlights. And if you have additional questions beyond the ones that have been posed here, let me know, let Aaron know, and we'll get with Weston and we'll get answers to you. So special thanks to our speaker, Weston Toll from the Colorado State Forest Service. And you can also contact him if you have any questions for him. So we're going to wrap it up. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.
Thank you.